right, so I get to be me today, so I'll talk about my. So I'm going to talk about depressional wetlands. So Pete mentioned yesterday in one of his slides that one of the long-term goals in a lot of the work we do, especially in our ambient monitoring programs, we focused real heavily on streams for the last 12 or more years. And so we're really interested in, California actually has other water body types in addition to streams. And so we're interested in expanding what we do under the SWAMP program and our ambient monitoring programs to make sure that we're including other water body types and understanding what the condition of all these resources are. So I'm going to talk about depressional wetlands today. So they're cool systems, and so they're fun to talk about. So let's go. So the big question, again, like many of our ambient monitoring programs, these questions should look familiar to you, right? We're really just fundamentally interested in answering this basic question of how healthy are our depressional wetlands in California. So it's a very basic question, and like many of our sort of swamp type of questions, it has the components of an extent and distribution question. So where are they and how are they distributed on the landscape? And what condition are they in? And if they're not in as good a condition as we'd like to see them in, what are the stressors that are causing the condition to be somewhat degraded? So those are really the basic questions we're trying to get at. And so if you look at these two pictures, we're trying to say, which one of these things is better than the other? Are they both good? Are they both bad? How do they relate? What's our frame of reference? So we're not 100% sure. So today I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm just going to define what we mean by depressional wetlands because they sort of transition between other water body types sometimes. Tell you a little bit more about why we're doing this besides just answering some basic assessment questions, how we went about doing it, and we have been sampling it now for 3 years, and so I have some results from the first 2 years of sampling that I'll present to you. So I actually do get to present some data in this talk, and then where we're going next on it. All right, so these depressional systems, and I'll come back to this in a couple of slides as well, but they function very differently than the loadic water bodies that we typically assess with our bioassessment tools. They're not flow-through systems. They tend to be closed systems. The hydrodynamics of these things are usually the water comes in through surface runoff or precipitation. It leaves through evapotranspiration or recharge or infiltration. And so because they're closed systems, the biological community can be different, and chemically what's happening in them can be different than in these flow-through systems. We want to distinguish them from lakes. So you also have wetlands associated with lakes, but they're distinguished from lakes basically by size and depth. So these are sort of, think of them as smaller, shallower versions of lakes, usually warmer temperatures and more vegetation, right? So if they get bigger or deeper, then they become lakes, and we assess them with lake tools. And they can be natural or man-made. So this is just a slide showing some whole bunches of different things that we might call depressional wetlands. We have some like vernal pools, which we have whole separate assessment programs focusing on, but stock ponds, golf course ponds. In fact, we've done some interesting sort of historical mapping and see that in a lot of our golf courses, some of the ponds were historically wetlands at one point in time. But they can be man-made. They're sometimes used as mitigation sites, stormwater treatment locations. So they come in lots of shapes and sizes. So why do we care about them? Well, by area, they're our largest wetland resource in the state of California. So this pie chart comes from the last State of the State's Wetlands report, which came out in 2010. It's wrong, right, because we actually have woefully inadequate wetland mapping in the state of California. That's a different story, talk for another day. But based on our best estimate, we believe about 60% of the wetland area in the state of California are these depressional wetlands, and they're all over the landscape. They're subject to lots of pressures because they tend to be relatively small and isolated, often on private property, so there's lots of pressure on these things, and we really don't know very much about them. So it makes them hard to manage. So for lots of reasons, whether it's 305B, 303D sort of integrated reporting needs, or water quality certifications, 401, 404 type of permits, there's lots of regulatory drivers why we might want to know something about these systems. All right, so the challenges in terms of assessing, so if we want to go ahead and do this assessment and understand what the condition of these resources are, we need assessment tools. And so we have to modify some of the existing assessment tools that we already have at our disposal. And so a lot of the assessment tools that we're starting with were developed for systems like this and to assess the types of function and dynamics in those systems. And as I talked about before, these systems are really different, and so we need to think about how we might modify those assessment tools and the expectations to account for these different types of systems. And these tools need to be robust enough to capture this idea of seasonality. So just like in streams, they can be wet or dry. This is one of our sampling sites, Zuniga Marsh, and it shows you what it looks like in May and what it looks like in November. And depending on how wet of the year, so that it can be seasonal, and that can vary from year to year. So we have to be able to account for some of that drying down or that seasonality. And they can occur in lots of different settings. The top picture here, this is more of a natural wetland. You can see sort of the wetting and drying footprint of that system. This is one of my favorite, actually, wetlands. This is Madrona Marsh in Torrance. So it's completely surrounded, by the urban infrastructure. And this is actually a really interesting wetland because historically, this is a natural wetland. And this wetland, the reason that, this is just a little side. Can I take a little side here, Jim? Is that good? All right, thanks. All right. So one of the reasons that the Corps of Engineers regulatory program actually regulates these types of water bodies is because of a Supreme Court decision involving this wetland, right? So when this wetland was going to be filled way back when, there was a Friends of Madrona Marsh, and they sued the Corps of Engineers, who said, we don't regulate these. It went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided, yes, they are regulated water bodies. So it's actually a really important wetland. And it's actually in pretty good condition because it's pretty heavily managed by the city of Torrance. So it's actually a cool little site. By a hotel, that's right. So just a little side trivia about Madrona Marsh. So anyways, before I get into the data, and I'm going to show you a bunch of data slides, I just wanted to I'll start with the punchline, right? Because you've sat through 3 talks, you might be sort of glazed over a little bit. So I'm just going to get right to the punchline. Punchline is, our assessment tools work, so we still think they need a little bit of tweaking, but they generally work. We can use them to assess condition. But some of the patterns we see in terms of stress are very different in streams and depressional wetlands. So in streams, a large part of the stress that we're concerned about in terms of particularly how it affects the biological communities, the bugs and the algae, are really hydrologic and physical in nature, right? And so we're really changes in hydrology, changes in sedimentation, erosion, hydromodification. Those are the things that tend to be having a lot of influence on the biological community. And less, the chemistry is in most of our sites tends to be a little less important. Whereas in the depressional wetlands, the chemistry that's going on within these sites is a lot more important, and it seems like our biological indicators are responding much more to the chemistry than they are to the physics or the hydrology in the system. And so that's kind of the big punchline. If you forget all the data slides and all the other things I'm going to show you, this is kind of the major message that I want you to walk away with. All right, so let's talk a little bit more in detail. So I told you that the first thing we want to know is something about where our depressional wetlands are. And so that's important not only because we want to kind of know extent and distribution, but Carrie talked about the probabilistic sampling we're doing. If you're going to do probabilistic sampling, you need a sample frame, right? So you need a good map to start with of where your resources are so you can randomly pick sites off of it. So if you don't have a good map, you can't really do a good probabilistic program. So this map of California is from the most recent iteration of the California Aquatic Resources Inventory, which talks about where our status of mapping efforts in the state of California. So all you really need to know is that everything in color here are areas where we have relatively recent, relatively high quality maps that we can use, what we feel comfortable using in terms of knowing where our depressional wetlands are and creating a sample frame. Everything in gray is the National Wetlands Inventory, which is, has its issues, right? And so mostly the NWI maps are old, they're mixed quality and vintage, and so we don't feel they're very reliable. So for now, we can do this type of probabilistic sampling in any of these areas of the state that are shown in the different colors. But don't get too depressed, because I actually have a potential solution for the rest of the parts of the state, but I'm not going to tell you about it. If you want, in the interest of time, ask me about it at the break or afterwards if there's time, and I'll tell you about how we think we can solve this problem for the rest of the state. That's a little tease there. All right. So let's look at Southern California. When we pulled up the wetland maps that were done by Cal State Northridge for Southern California, we just queried out, show me all the depressional wetlands on the maps. This is what it looks like. So they're kind of everywhere, right? About a density of about 4 wetlands per hectare. So then we start to tunnel in. We have to do some culling. And so what this bar graph shows is of all the features we looked at on that map, about 70%, that's this darker bar, about 70% were what we would call wetlands. The others were things like flood control basins that were fully concrete lined and things like that we kicked out. So of those, we looked just using Google Images and tried to find out which ones were at least wet enough at the time where we thought we could do some bioassessment work there. So about a little more than half of those were wet. The other half were sort of persistently dry, so we sort of dropped those out. And so of those, 75% were depressional wetlands that sort of carried over to the reconnaissance phase, right? And the others were all the things you see at top, and the top. I just wanted to mention this one a little bit. The way the mapping is done, if you have a depression on a floodplain, it's mapped as a depression. But for the purposes of our survey, if the predominant hydrology is overbank flow that fills that little depression, we consider that part of the riverine system and not a depressional wetland. And so that's why those get kicked out. All right. So recon, right? That's always the big bugaboo with recon. And so just a little bit of summary of how our recon went. So of those sites, so basically if we start with these sites here, 70% fail the office screens, right, for different reasons, right? So the ones that pass the office screens and we go out to the field and assess them in the field, 80% of the ones that we look at in the field fail the field screens. And so overall, we have about a 6% success rate. So that means for every 1,000 sites that we draw, we get 60 sites that we can sample. So it's bad, but it's actually not that much worse than streams. The streams in Southern California is more like 10% maybe or something like that. So it's, it takes a lot of work on the front end. And the main reasons we fail are obviously, no surprise, access and that they're too dry to sample. So if you're thinking about doing this type of program in another part of the state, this is just something to keep in mind that you have to pull a lot of sites in your draw to get enough sampleable sites. So in the first 3 years of our sampling, we've sampled 53 sites, and this shows you where they are. And I'll tell you a little bit more about these later, but you can see they're kind of well represented throughout the Southern California landscape. So this is a slightly more than the map that Carrie showed you because we haven't done microcystin in all these sites, and that's why her map looked a little bit different. All right, so how did we go about? So I told you a little bit about the mapping and the recon. So how did we do the assessment piece? So we started with the tools we had to work with. So we didn't actually have any sort of ready out-of-the-box tools. So a big part of this effort in terms of building the capacity for the state is to modify or refine the assessment tools that we have. So for the benthic macroinvertebrates, Kevin Lundy, who's here somewhere I know, Kevin had developed an IBI for the San Francisco Bay Area, which he actually presented here a year or two ago. So we took Kevin's IBI and have been using it in Southern California, and it for the most part works well. And then for the diatoms, which is one of the other indicators, we are using the perennial stream diatom IBI that Betty Fetcher developed. And so, as I'll show you in some of the other slides, it's a little more challenging, right? And so, because we're taking a stream IBI and trying to apply it to a lentic water body, whereas the benthic invertebrate IBI was at least developed for depressional wetlands. And then we have CRAM, which is pretty good out of the box, right? So the CRAM is, we have a depressional wetland module for CRAM, and that's good out of the box. So a big part of this is refining the assessment tools and sort of recalibrating them in some cases to work for the types of systems we're interested in. We've also done a lot of work on developing field methods and assessment protocols, SOPs. We've worked with the Moss Landing on the swamp crews at Moss Landing. Marco sitting back there has been great, helping us develop all of the templates and the data templates so we can get all of this information to the swamp database. So a big part of this is not just doing the assessment, but also building the infrastructure that we need so that we can sort of grow this program to do more statewide assessment. So it's been great working with all of our partners to develop that capacity. So our approach is, again, the typical type of approach that we use. That's a multi-indicator approach. So as I mentioned, we use the benthic it's actually invertebrates because it's not actually just benthic, because some of the invertebrates that we look at are also more pelagic. So we use the invertebrates, we use the diatoms as our condition indicators. We look at water column chemistry and sediment toxicity as our stressors. And then CRAM is does a little bit of both. It does some condition and some stress. So those are our indicators. These are the things we measure. You heard a little bit from Carrie on the cyanotoxin work. I'm not going to talk about that in this talk, but you can see the types of things we're measuring. This is our basic assessment approach. And so the assessment approach we use, it's a transect approach. So for the depressional wetland, we do 10 transects around the entire circumference of the wetland. We have sort of these side-by-side type of transects, because more so in the streams, you have to be really, if you want to do, you can't sample your bugs and your algae on the same transects, right? Because the way you sample this is you start at the margin and you wade into the wetland till you're about sort of kind of waist deep or so, and you do your sampling on these transects. So when you're doing that, you're sort of stirring up the sediments, and so you have to sample the diatoms and the bugs sort of on adjacent transects. And so we've done this, we've developed these protocols, we've tested this in wetlands, small wetlands, and wetlands up to about 7 or 8 hectares. In the larger wetlands, we did some subsampling, so we did 30 transects and then looked at different positions of the wetland to see if there was spatial heterogeneity, and what we found is this type of 10 transect approach, even for big systems, tends to be a pretty good approach. So even in those big systems, there's not a lot of within-site variability, in other words. So we came up with this first protocol document based on the work we did in 2011. The swamp field crews, we worked with the field crews out of both Moss Landing and the Aquatic Bioassessment Lab, and so they've given us a ton of great input in terms of how to refine the protocol. So this SOP document is under revision right now. We hope before the next field season, have a new version of this document out that incorporates all the input from the swamp crews that they've given us over the last couple of years. So we'll have a nice field manual for that. All right, so that's all the kind of background. Now let's get to the data. So what I want to just show you with the last time I have left is some of the preliminary results on both the condition and the stress data. And so what I'm going to show you is data from 38 sites. These are the 2011 and 2012. We haven't analyzed the 2013 samples yet. Well, I'm going to show you CRAM, algae, which is diatoms, and some of the chemistry data. The benthic the invertebrate data, we've just relatively recently gotten that data, and so we're still working that up, and so I don't have the invertebrate results to show you today, but hopefully at a future presentation I can share those with you. All right, so let's talk about basic condition. We'll start with CRAM because it's kind of our biggest picture assessment tool. So this is a frequency distribution plot. It shows the CRAM scores, which go from 25 to 100, and this is a cumulative frequency on the y-axis. And so basically this reference line, we're fortunate with our depressional wetlands, we have a statewide reference network, and so we have CRAM data from reference sites. So I pulled the reference sites from just Southern California, and this is the 95 percentile confidence interval for the reference sites here. It's about 65. So basically everything here is reference. This is non-reference. So basically about 40% of the sites are in reference condition, and about 60% of the sites are below reference condition. Right? And so that's kind of the main threshold that we look at. So it gives us a little bit of a snapshot of kind of the overall condition of these sites in Southern California. Now, one of the interesting things is if we look at the relationship of these sites with some of our traditional sort of landscape scale indicators, and we've looked at percent impervious, we've looked at urban land use, ag land use, road density, all the typical sort of landscape scale parameters that we've looked at. We looked at it at scales really close to the wetland as well as up to 3 kilometers, so big and small. And pretty consistently we see this type of pattern, right? Just a lot of noise in a sense, not any real meaningful relationship that we can see in that data. So there seems to be not a strong relationship between what's going on in the surrounding landscape and what we're seeing within the wetland in terms of the CRAM scores at least. And this holds true if we look at the component attributes of CRAM as well, you see the same type of pattern. But if we group these sites based on the in land, what we might call intensity of the use within the wetland itself, then we start to see some patterns. So here along the x-axis, I have the type of use in that wetland. So everything from no active use, these are just sort of natural features on the landscape, to abandoned stock ponds, which are the next closest thing to a natural feature on the landscape, all the way down through golf course ponds, flood control, some water supply facilities. So you can kind of see that they tend to break out more by what's happening at that site and less dependent on kind of what's happening in the surrounding landscape. So definitely what's happening proximate in that is having an effect from a CRAM perspective. All right, so that was CRAM. Let's talk about diatoms. So this is the same frequency distribution plot, just with our diatom IBI on the x-axis instead of CRAM. And so this line here, this is the reference line I got from Betty's work that looks at, and again, that reference line is based on streams, right? So basically looking at our reference streams and looking at the diatom IBI in our reference streams. So you'd look at this and you'd say, well, that means 90% of our sites are less than reference. But if you look at the shape of the curve and we look at the data closely, I don't actually believe that line, and that's why I put the question mark there, because I think given especially that this IBI is a stream IBI and we're applying it to a lentic water body, we're pretty confident that we need to recalibrate the IBI. And so it works in the sense, and I'll show you some of the data relationships that we think it's sensitive to some of the stressors we're interested in, but we're pretty confident that we need to recalibrate this based on reference data for depressional wetlands and maybe even refine some of the structure of the IBI. So that's work that we're going to be doing over the next year. It's kind of going back into the data and trying to see if we can relook at how the IBI is calibrated to make it a little more well-tuned for the depressional wetlands. And unlike the CRAM, the same type of intensity of land use or intensity of use relative to the diatom, we don't see that same type of pattern. It's just more random in terms of that. However, water chemistry does seem to be a better predictor for the diatom IBI. So what I'm showing you here is just the diatom IBI as a function of total phosphorus. This is water column, right? Water column phosphorus. And so you can kind of see this sort of nice wedge-shaped curve. I just note these are actually some pretty high numbers, right, for phosphorus. And I'll show you some more about the sort of trophic status of these systems in a moment. But we actually see this kind of nice wedge-shaped curve where the IBI seems to be responsive to some of the water chemistry. And we can look at other things like alkalinity and specific conductance and see the same types of patterns. I had a whole bunch of other data, looking at the component metrics, and we see some really interesting patterns. Some of the component metrics within this IBI, like the percent of phosphorus tolerant taxa, the sedimentation tolerant taxa. We see a lot of the same types of relationships. So we're seeing these nice consistency in terms of how the IBI is responding to chemical factors in these wetlands. So that's actually really interesting. The conundrum is we don't have chemistry data at our reference sites, so that's something we'll come back to at the end and see if we can. We need to get more chemistry data at the reference sites to help us refine the index. And so I just put this plot up just to talk a little bit about the trophic status. This is chlorophyll A in parts per billion. And these are those same land use categories. And so I just plotted the chlorophyll A levels. And the main thing I want you to take home from this is this 10 ppb line I put on here. That's the boundary between oligotrophic and mesotrophic for warm water lakes. So we don't have this set for wetlands, but we do have a number for lakes that we're working with. It's a preliminary number. It hasn't been totally vetted, but based on some of the preliminary stuff that's been done in the lakes, this would be a boundary where these would be oligotrophic down here, and above the line would be either mesotrophic or eutrophic. So it kind of gives you a sense of kind of the trophic status of these systems. And then the last data graph I was going to show you, so it made me think, well, what about water chemistry and our land use parameters? And again, we don't really see a strong relationship. It appears that the water chemistry may be driven more by things that are locally happening in that wetland and less by the surrounding landscape. And that's reflected if we regress the IBI versus disturbance. We sort of see the same sort of noisy pattern. So, all right, so that's kind of a preview. That's the first couple years of data. We have another year of data and all the bug stuff to go through, so more to come on this. But I just wanted to end by telling you where we're going next. So really excited. In 2014, we're going to be working with Kevin and the folks up in the San Francisco Bay Area to work on expanding this program into the San Francisco Bay region. So we'll be doing that in 2014. The Central Coast Wetland Work Group out of Moss Landing has a grant to do some depressional wetland work as part of their validation of the CRAM module for depressional wetlands. So we'll be working with the folks at Moss Landing over the next couple of years as well to do some more data collection there. So we're hoping that we'll continue to kind of build the picture of being able to get a better understanding of what's going on in multiple regions of the state. All right, so conclusions, these things are ubiquitous on the landscape. They're important, pay attention to them. They have function, they do cool things, and they're everywhere, right? The reconnaissance is challenging, as always, but we're encouraged. Our assessment tools seem to work. They might need to be recalibrated in some cases, but we think we have a good starting point. Some of the interesting things are, again, that the land use screens that we typically look at may be too coarse, so we may need to be paying more attention to what's happening locally within the wetlands and explore that a little bit further. And so in terms of recommendations for the future, in addition, I already talked about this one, we definitely need water chemistry at our reference sites because we need to kind of rethink a little bit probably how we define reference. There's also things we're thinking about maybe looking on the diatoms in addition to rescaling the index of either using, we just focused on the diatoms, we have a soft-bodied algae tool as well, which we haven't really explored, and we focus mainly on the benthic diatoms, and so there's also a planktonic component. And so there's other ways we could look at this if we decide to sort of dive into it a little bit more. So with that, I'll wrap it up.
Thank you, Eric. You showed how these pools dry down and refill and whatnot. Isn't your chemistry data just a snapshot in time? I mean, if the pool's drying down, then these different, alkalinity is going up, pH is going up. If it rained the day before you went and took your samples, pH was going down. Just with the hydrophytic vegetation, I mean, you're going to have huge swings in pH from day to night when they go from photosynthesis to respiration. Have you accounted for any of that in your data?
Yeah, so the question was basically our water chemistry is sensitive to a lot of things during the wetting and drying cycle, and so the answer is yes, right? So like the chemistry is a snapshot in time and it's reflective. So we have done at a few of our sites in 2011. We put some data sondes out to collect some more time variable data on some of the parameters that we can instrument. And so when we develop the index period for the sampling, so again, just like with the bugs, we have an index period, and so we try to set the index period very early in the season. And so we're sampling these things even before we're typically sampling our streams. So really early in the season, so we try to time the index period at kind of a more stable part of the cycle within the wetland. So for the bug and diatom community as well as for the water chemistry, we're trying to get that period. But without a doubt, it's reflective of that period of time, and those conditions most definitely will change over the course of the season. Again, going back to Carrie's talk, we know, for example, the microcystins, we're sampling much earlier in the season than probably when they're peaking in terms of concentrations, right? So yeah, that's definitely something that caveat has to be kept in mind when looking at all the data, for sure.
My other question involves federally endangered species. Mm-hmm. A lot of these wetlands, especially the ones there in Southern California, a lot of them have federally listed invertebrates. Some of the ones in the Bay Area have federally listed amphibians. Did you guys get permits so you could collect, or did that truncate also which pools you selected?
Yeah, it was a list. So the question had to do with federally listed species. So it was the latter. So we do not sample pools. So we don't sample vernal pools at all. So they're out of our sample frame. So all the endangered vernal pool species, but things like red-legged frog, for example, that you might have. So we worked with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the USGS, who do a lot of monitoring in these areas. And so if they are suspected to have threatened and endangered species, we don't sample them because we don't have the permits to be in there. So.
Thank you, Eric.
Yes, and I may not have explained, but there was a little tweak at the end. The speaker that was supposed to be next is going to do it after the break because she had a very important conference call, and we'll explain that later. But Rafael Mazur is going to come up and give his presentation now on PHAB, developing a index for physical habitat in streams.